Okay, everyone. So as you can see, I now have opened the folder that I created in the last video with my JSON data in it, right? This that I got from the API at the Federal Reserve Economic Database. I'm looking to sort of duplicate what I saw in that Washington Post chart. And so just confirming that it's here, if I open it up, I'm getting it as a text file. I can also certainly open it in Aptana. But of course, if I want to load this into a page, I have to first create a page. So I'm going to go through our usual process here. I'm going to start up Aptana. I'm going to create an HTML file and save it. And then instead of writing JavaScript directly in my HTML file and then moving it, I'm going to immediately create a separate JavaScript file. And so I'm just going to go here and say new from template, right? Our sort of typical, there we go. Okay, our sort of typical workflow at this point here. And I'm going to say Ajax experiment, right? And let's show some data, right? Sounds like a good idea. I'm going to go to save this to my local file system. As usual, I'm going to choose so Ajax example.html, right? We're good with that. So now the next thing that I want to do is immediately create a JavaScript file. So again, we're not going to go through that. Let's write it in the HTML and then copy it to the JavaScript. We're going to immediately create the JavaScript file and include it in our HTML file. So I'm just going to say, and I'm just going to, in this, I'm just going to say, JavaScript is working, right? So we understand now that when I put it in a, when I put it in a JavaScript file like this, right, I can just write JavaScript. I don't have to have script tags or anything like that because that file extension lets the browser know that this is JavaScript, right? I don't have to be more explicit than that. So again, I'm going to call this scripts.js. We're going to talk about naming conventions next week as well. We've been kind of naming things randomly. Even now I've sort of named them descriptively and randomly, which is fine. But sometimes it's handy to have sort of conventions, right? We use a lot of conventions in programming because it sort of helps us not have to remember lots and lots of different names of things. So I'm going to go ahead and save scripts.js just here with that console log statement. And again, that's just going to give me a way to check when I open up my HTML file in my browser that that JavaScript is being loaded, etc. So now I'm going to, again, add this, let's see, script source equals, and it's going to know, right? But obviously it's just the name of my file, scripts.js. Type is going to be text JavaScript. Be very careful that this comes out as JavaScript, not as JScript. They are not the same thing. Would that they were, I guess. Make life easier. And of course, pose my script tag. Okay, so if all is well, what I should be seeing here, I'm going to say eventually, right? So I'm going to go ahead and do this. Now I'm going to open this in my web browser, and it's going to be very important in this example that the web browser we look at things through is Firefox. We'll talk a little bit in class about why that's important, but it needs to be Firefox. Okay, so I now have my Firefox window open. I'm going to, what am I going to do? Inspect element, that's going to give me something weird, but I'm going to go to the console log here, and I can see that yes, indeed, my JavaScript is working. That's lovely. I'm also going to recommend that most of you guys install Firebug, which I may do at the break. Firebug is a much more, it's a bit less confusing, I find, than looking at this. Firebug shows things like the console window and the HTML inspector much more similarly to the way that Chrome does natively. Okay, so this is a good sign. My JavaScript is working, right? I know that that's getting loaded. So now we've seen how we can include our own JavaScript externally, but one of the great and powerful things about using JavaScript is that lots of other people use JavaScript too. And one of the things that comes out of that is that people have created a lot of really handy libraries that do things that would normally be really kind of finicky and nuanced. They've kind of done them for us already, and these libraries we can leverage to be able to approach our own work a bit more simply. One of the most popular of these libraries, some of you may have heard of it, is called jQuery. And jQuery was developed by a guy named John Russig. who basically has been putting it together over the last few years. It has a big developer community now. But the primary reason that we use jQuery is because it gives us really handy shortcuts for doing things like loading data and also adding elements to our page and kind of manipulating the page. And so there's a lot of things that jQuery does or can do, but those are the ones that we're going to focus on here because they're going to be sort of the most important for us. So the other handy thing about it is because jQuery is so popular, there are companies that host versions of the code so that rather than, we can always download the code, it's open source and we can save a local copy, but it's also handy to be able to reference it somewhere else. That way we know that the version that we're working on is always up to date and we don't have to, if we create a project, we don't have to worry about fixing it later. So if you go ahead and Google this, we'll post a link to this as well, but what we want to look at here is we want to look for CDN. CDN is a content distribution network, I believe. Content delivery network, sorry. And basically it's like Amazon or anything like that, and it means that if somebody is looking at this far away, it still loads quickly. We don't really need to worry too much about what the specifics of it are, but basically it gives us a way to include jQuery in our page, and you can see I've got this nice snippet right here without having to download anything. And so I'm going to go ahead and take this and put it in my page. I feel like there's something weird happening here. I feel like this should have an HTTP. So we're going to give this a test. So essentially what I've done is I've said, okay, I have this thing that's local, right? And I have this thing that's on the internet, and I would like to load that internet thing. Now, how are we going to test if this library loaded correctly? One of the primary features of jQuery is, or sort of its main functions, is what we call this document-ready function. So the thing about the web is, even though, if we're lucky, things load very quickly, most of us are aware of the fact, even if we go to, let's just go to Google, right, which loads pretty quickly. You see how the things kind of pop into the page here? Like, not everything shows up at the same time. That's because it actually takes time for code to travel around the world from wherever it's living on the internet to your browser. And it also takes some time for your browser to interpret it and make it look the way that, it wants it to look. What that means is that one of the primary things that we have to do, one of the primary things that we want to do before we try to start manipulating our page or adding elements to it, like the way that we want to add data to it, is we have to wait and make sure everything is loaded first, right? If we try to start, we try to start manipulating the page and some of the stuff isn't there, we're going to run into problems. So one of the primary functions of the jQuery library is actually to give us a little function that says, hey, is everything there? Has everything loaded? Are we ready to get going with our own programming at this point? And so that has a format of document ready. And so I'm just going to look up jQuery document ready. Now, unfortunately, jQuery has changed. They have changed their documentation setup. They used to have a really nice tutorial on this, and I haven't been able to locate it. They've sort of moved stuff around. But basically, what we're looking for is this. So this $sign is a way that it's a shorthand in jQuery, and we don't really need to worry too much about what it does. But basically, what you can do is understand that anytime we start using the $sign, it means that we are referring to snippets of code. We're referring to functions and code that's actually in the jQuery library, and not necessarily sort of part of JavaScript proper. jQuery is a library built on JavaScript. It is written in JavaScript, right? So in that sense, they're equivalent. But because jQuery gives us shorthand, the way that we indicate to the computer that we want to use that shorthand is we put a $sign in front of things. So I'm going to come back to my JavaScript file here. Okay, and I am going to put in, now we see this thing that says handler. What the heck is handler? Handler is actually going to be a function. So we touched lightly on functions in the videos last week, and we're going to do a little bit more with them this week. But basically what I can do is say page function page loaded. Okay. what is function? So remember, functions are our verbs. So the things that we've looked at already are functions like console log. Okay, so log is a function, it's a verb, right, that says, hey, I want you to print this stuff out to the console. Console log. Spit this stuff out on the console for me. This is a verb that the browser and computer know how to do. It's an action that they already know how to perform. But the thing that's cool is that we can define actions that we want the computer to perform. And we do that by using this function keyword. So the same way that we say var something, and that var, my variable means create a box in memory called variable. Well, function basically says create a recipe for some actions, some activities, and call it page loaded, okay? And in this case, I'm gonna say my document, right? So I can use one function inside another. That's perfectly acceptable, right? And basically here what I'm going to say is, okay, page loaded. So if jQuery has loaded properly and everything works fine, then what we should expect is that that we will see this console log, my document is loaded. I'm also just, for the heck of it, I'm going to put another console log in here saying, sort of with my original statement, right, which said JS file scripts JS file loaded, because we're going to look a little bit at how the order of this works. Okay, so proof is in the pudding. Let's see what happens. Actually, at this point, I can look at this. Well, I'll just go back to Firefox. Where's my Firefox window? Where did you go, Firefox window? Ah, there you are. Okay, so I've got my console log open. Let's see what happens. Hey, there we go. Looks pretty good, right? So it's actually giving us a little bit more information. It's saying, hey, go get this file, right? So this is actually, again, it's being loaded from the internet, which is fine. We can totally do that. It's one of the great powers of this technology is that we don't have to have everything local to our computer. We don't have to write everything ourselves, right? We can use these other things. So script.js file loaded, okay, so that corresponds to this statement. And my document is loaded, which looks good. My document is loaded. Now, interesting thing here. This appears after this statement, and yet in the console log, this one appears first. So I want to point this out because it's a really key concept, which is that this document ready, in this case, we've talked about how how computers read programs the way that we read, right? This function is a recipe, right? It's a recipe for what to do once the page has loaded, okay? This recipe only gets activated, right? It only gets executed once all the HTML, right? So after all this stuff is loaded, once this is rendered, doesn't look like a lot, but it only will happen after that. Meanwhile, this console log statement happens as soon as it's going to spit this out to the console as soon as it reads it. And so what we want you to understand is that this is waiting. This is what we mean by asynchronous, right? This is synchronous. As soon as it gets read, it gets executed. This is asynchronous because it's waiting for something to happen. It's waiting for all of this stuff to load, and then it's going to say, right, now I want you to follow that recipe that says console log, my document is loaded. This is a tricky concept. You guys are we're gonna work on some exercises in class to kind of make this a little bit more tangible, but it's a really fundamental component of sort of the programming that we're going to be doing. I promise you'll get the hang of it. Also just want to point out that similar to our variables, right, we have to define our function before we refer to it, right? So the same way that we have to introduce Mr. Smith or any variable before we talk about it, we want to introduce our functions before we try to use them somewhere. All right, we'll be back next time to look at how we actually use this to load data onto our page.